Welcome to hopefully yet another edition of my Deuze vlog. My name is Mark Deuze. I'm a professor of media studies at the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. And I am conducting a series of interviews with professionals, practitioners, academics, industry people from around the world, all one way or another involved in working on the health and well-being of people in creative careers, in part to support the publication of my book, Well-Being and Creative Careers, What Makes You Happy Can Also Make You Sick. And today I have an interview with somebody I can honestly say I'm a bit of a fan of, Dr. Susan Raeburn. Dr. Susan Raeburn is a clinical therapist working out of Oakland in the United States, specializing in rock and pop musicians and their particular struggles. She was one of the first people worldwide who started publishing academic work on the specific nature of health and well-being issues that people in the rock and pop music industry face. Her dissertation was published in 1984. She was trained at UCLA, the Wright Institute, Berkeley, the Stanford University Medical Center. She speaks at all kinds of music industry events around the world, South by Southwest, Music Cares, the Future of Music Coalition, and so on and so forth. She plays a powerful, and she has been playing a powerful role in PAMA, the Performing Arts Medical Association. And as our interview will show, she kind of put rock and pop music and the music industry and health and well-being issues related to that on the map for PAMA. She's on the board still of its journal. She wrote several chapters in the recent Touring and Mental Health, the Music Industry Manual, put together by Thames and Ambleton, and a powerful resource for people in the industry insofar their health and well-being is concerned while on the road. She also co-authored a book with Eric Meisel called Creative Recovery, addictions treatment programs that are based on people's creativity. Our interview is just lovely and eclectic and all over the place. It touches upon all the different things that make caring about health in creative careers so important, the way people embody their labor and what that means, the significance of people like Lady Gaga and Chappelle Roan speaking out on health and well-being, the problematic nature of the star system and the myth of creative careers, and I think something that powers both our work, if I may be so arrogant, is a concern with the everyday professional practitioners in media work. So not necessarily the stars and the people who've made it and the directors and the editors-in-chief and the rock stars and everything, but just everybody and anyone who makes creative work possible. Please enjoy our conversation. Please check out all the other conversations in this series. And drop a line, leave a comment, send a note. Always love hearing from you.
So let me thank you for inviting me. And, I feel like people going on Rachel Maddow, or something here in the States going like, oh, thank you for being here. Thank you for inviting me. But I mean it, too.
Well, thank you. It's such a privilege. I mean, and to stay within the sort of rock and pop music lingo, like I'm a fan. So this is truly a treat. So
well, if
thanks
you,
so much.
You're a bass player. So, from that standpoint, a different conversation would be like, what bands are you listening to? Because, I'm older, but I still like pay attention. I loved it on that when I met you with the thing from University of Aberdeen. Right. Talking about, and I mentioned some story about, the guitar player in Div talking about something, and George Musgrave goes like, I love that band. I went, oh my God, my people, even though I'm older than you guys, So anyway, that was fun.
It
Um,
is, and it's so important to acknowledge that because especially when you're in sort of an academic setting, it becomes sometimes too easy to forget that we're also human beings with passions and fandoms, and and
sure.
that infuses what we care about. I mean, I'm convinced of that.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
you'll hear some of my comments about the themes that I kind of rely on these days, both personally and in the work.
Well,
But
that was actually my opening, salvo. I mean, you've stated, I mean, and you mentioned this on your website and in older material and interviews that, that for you growing up with musicians as parents and being part of a sort of an artist community that
yeah,
inspired and fueled your interest, not just in playing music as you do, but also in caring about
yes,
the professional identities of people and the lives of people, the well-being of people in these industries. Can, can
yes,
you
very
can you
much.
talk a little bit about that specific influence? Was it
Yeah.
because you saw problems and you wanted to solve them, or it was more? I mean, how did that develop, Susan?
Well, the short answer is all of the above, but I did write a couple of things. And for people who were not exactly big band fans, who may never have heard of Boyd Rayburn, my father, or my mother, who was the band vocalist, Ginny Powell.
Mhm.
Anyways, so I wrote a little tiny thing just to orient my comments on that. So what I said is my dad, Boyd Rayburn, had an avant-garde big band in basically in the 40s before I was born was the heyday of the band.
Right.
And they recorded like 6 albums for Savoy, which was like a major jazz label.
Yeah.
And then after George Finkel, who was a classically trained, brilliant arranger, left the band to go to Stan Kenton, where guess what? He wanted to get paid, stuff like that. So, a lot of my dad's band probably was a little too avant-garde. He was not Stan Kenton. That's a whole other backstory about what I learned from getting to know Stan Kenton's daughter. She wrote a book about some bad stuff with Stan Kenton. Anyway,
Right.
so one description of my dad's big band was it was a pre-bebop prep school. So a lot of young musicians like Dizzy Gillespie were ended up playing with my dad at different times. And I
Mhm.
have my favorite record of my dad's is called Boyd Meets Stravinsky from probably about 1947 or something.
Right.
And Dizzy does the first version of what became Night in Tunisia, but
Ah,
under the title of Interlude on that record. And my mother sings Temptation, and Shelly Mann's on that record. It was my favorite of the Savoy records. And then after George Finkel left, uh, my dad cut a couple of records on Columbia that I think they were trying to make it be like one was called Dance Spectacular and one was called Fraternity Rush. They were trying to market it to like college kids and get some get some sales going on. And I never appreciated those records until I saw the series Mad Men. It was all
ah.
about the 50s and I grew up
Mhm.
in Manhattan in the 50s. So, then I started going, well, these albums are not that bad. But anyway, so my point being, in my childhood, the big bands had died out like dinosaurs, and my father did not have the spectacular solo chops that other artists did, like, who got to go do like Dave Brubeck Quartet.
Sure.
My father did not have an easy time making the transition from the record sales doing this and no touring. So anyway, some tragedy came in there, not helped by alcohol, and again, it was not a surprise that I ended up um, working with a lot of people in addiction recovery and stuff like that because of my childhood personal stuff. So anyway, we ended up moving to the Bahamas and with the idea from New York to Nassau when it was still a British colony. So I grew up seeing God Save the Queen, at Queen's College, my school and stuff. Love the
Right.
uniforms. I still love like menswear from growing up, in a British Methodist school for a while. Um, Plus punk rock, but okay. So
Perfect combination.
yeah, yeah. Well, it all, influences me in there. But So, when we were in Nassau, the idea of my dad was friends with people like William Gaines, the publisher of Mad
Yeah.
Magazine, and, a bunch of hip guys who loved the band and had money. So we ended up in the Bahamas with the idea of my parents were going to open a jazz club and my mom would be the vocalist and my dad would run it. And then, very out of the blue, the tragic part of my childhood story is that my mother contracted meningitis and died at 33 years old in the Bahamas when I was 8 and my big brother was 10. So, needless to say, a lot of stuff went, you know, my dad did not do well with adapting. And, long story long, that we ended up in LA with an aunt and uncle. So I grew up in LA, during like the summer of love and, just so a lot of my and also the good cool thing about for me, given that my childhood was too chaotic for me to ever take music lessons formally or anything, I always thought I wanted to learn how to play piano, but didn't happen. But um, my high school boyfriend, Phil, had a really great band for a kid, and he was a vocalist and guitar player. And he taught me enough chords. And he bought me like a Gibson B25,
Nice.
back then. So I played a lot of guitar and just learned. I never took formal lessons to my disadvantage now, but I still play. And I have a slow version of I Want to Be Sedated, and like You're Pushing Too Hard by Sky Sax and the Seeds, et cetera, et cetera. And just have seen tons of music. So the whole thing about the impact on me of all that story is, I identify with musicians heavily. I love music. I loved seeing T-Bone Burnett on his birthday, like last year at a club in Berkeley called Freight and Salvage, great small club.
Right.
And he was, first of all, he was there with like all these guys he's played with for 30 years. So the camaraderie and the heart of all that, really is what I think about with musicians. And T-Bone Burnett told a great story about what turned him on to music heavily as a child was hearing Jerry Lee Lewis' song, Whole Lot of Shaking Going On.
Mm.
And I'm going, I have the same reaction. For me, it was listening to like Elvis doing Treat Me Nice and Don't Be Cruel and seeing him on, Ed Sullivan or some shit. So, the heart of that is really what inspired my friendships and, my life in that way. So I love that my friends in LA sent me an article, called me like in the, probably in the late 80s saying, have you seen the LA Times? And I went, why would I see that? And they said, oh, there's a whole article by Leonard Feather about Boyd and the band. And I went, no kidding. So of course I got it. And Leonard Feather called my father a posthumous cult figure.
Oh,
So
wow.
that gives you kind of a sense. I go, no wonder I didn't get married till later in life with that story. Anyway, so that's my long-winded answer to your first question.
No,
Um,
thank you
you
so
know,
much, Susan. It's to be maybe too much information, but I'm the result of a one night stand of a big band play touring, and then the bass
oh,
player meeting a nurse in the audience,
I was
and
going to say
then
my father wasn't involved. Hopefully, sort of kidding.
big reveal, yeah.
Yeah, you're my brother. You're actually my brother.
And that was actually the Summer of Love. That was 1969. So there
Oh
you
my
go.
gosh. Okay.
So that's no, but it's I yeah, I really appreciate you sharing that because it's important, I think, for us to acknowledge, where we came from and how that has shaped our interests and our work and our focus. And I mean, I've always actually wondered whether, being part of a music scene and playing a little bit of music myself as you do, um, whether that proclivity also shapes the way we do our work, like the connections we make with our brain, or like when you, because of course you have a clinical therapy, so a practice, so you deal with clients and patients all the time. I mean, there's probably a very specific way in which you do that. Partly because you're formally trained, but
Right.
partly also because who you are as a person. Do you have a sense of how that works for you?
Yeah. Well, one thing, being in the field for a long time now, I used to tell when I was still working at, I used to always do private practice since the 80s and half-time institutional gig with health benefits and
Mhm.
then private practice. So I've always done that. So I worked at Stanford Medical Center for 10 years Mostly
Right.
working with like eating disorders and anxiety, and then alcohol and drug. After my cousin, who I was raised with, died of his cocaine habit, that's when I went, wow, with my family history and having done a dissertation on musicians, I go, I need to get some real training in this. So I started
Right.
working in that area more directly. But the things that I think and I want to say, like, as you know, like George Musgrave did, one of his many very significant papers where he looked at the mental health of professional musicians versus non-professional,
Right.
and I definitely am in the non-professional category, which sounds like a health benefit from George's article, but you know, um, let's see, I'm consulting my own notes about this now, so I'm on track. Um, Okay. So the thing that I think my playing music and being around that subculture, the music subcultures and seeing people in bands and all this is, I really have been more and more of a proponent and have talked at PAMA, the Performing Arts Medical Association, as you've mentioned, um, on the topic of social connection and the importance of that, and
Right.
also positive awe, as the positive psychology people talk about identifying with something greater than yourself, greater than my Susan Raeburn ego, right? So
Mm.
those two themes I really have incorporated personally and in the work. And then, trying to, what I like to say to clients, like help them update their software. The other part is having some sense of humility and not shame, but just knowing compared to my mother, compared to musicians I admire, I'm a big Sharon Van Etten fan and actually play a couple of her songs that the chords are easy enough for me to learn, and her phrasing is very distinct. But so, I really try to bring humility into this, not, in a good way, like a sense of balance, kind of
Mm.
humility. So that all definitely has influenced how I work as a therapist.
Right.
Um, so
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Um, I mean, I would, I mean, from where I'm sitting and how I know your work, I mean, that combination of sort of awe and respect for what musicians put themselves through to make their
yeah,
art, in combination of a sort of humility and wanting to give them their voice, right?
yes,
And not talk over them, but that's very much part of, I mean, your earliest writings and of course huge part of the reason for our conversation is also, I mean, the fact that you're one of the pioneers in writing scholarly about, taking the mental health and well-being of people in creative work seriously. I mean, your dissertation from 1984 stands as a benchmark in the field. I mean, the two publications coming out of that a couple of years later. And I was wondering, I mean, at the time, also in your dissertation and in these articles, you sounded a little bit lonely, right? It's like, where is everybody else that should be caring about this? Because it's really important,
yes,
right? People are struggling more so than in most other professional categories. I mean, we're losing some of our greatest talents to early mortality for a variety of reasons. We
yeah,
should care, but you were definitely among the very, very few internationally, almost completely alone. And then 10 years later, you wrote about this again, or 15 years later, and you said, okay, there are a couple of more people, but it's still like, and this was the late 1990s, and now we're now
right,
well into the 2020s.
yeah.
How do you see that history? I mean, from coming up with this, I imagine that maybe you had to fight to get this topic to be taken seriously. I don't know, but maybe that's the case. But and
Yeah.
then today, especially post-pandemic, that luckily so many more people and professional associations are taking a keen interest in this. How did you see this field evolve?
Yeah. No, all those points are so right on because I used to describe myself to anyone who gave a crap, called, I'm kind of a lone surfer out here. And, the only person, and there had been a big study from Australia about symphony orchestra stuff.
Right.
Somewhere in there, part of, and, some of this, part of what did help give me a little bit of a structure of, as opposed to just being really alone. And this is, in those days, I so wish now that I had known what Jeff Wills was doing in
Right.
Manchester, because I now consider him a good friend of mine. I only met him
Right.
once in person in London in like 2006.
Mm.
But what a great guy. And we used to send each other Christmas presents at one point until the customs was so expensive it was not worth it. But
Mm.
anyway, many years later, someone told me about Jeff, and I went, "What?" And like, wow, and I have to confess, which I think he understood, that I had a bit of a resentment against Jeff briefly, because in his book, Musicians Under Pressure or whatever,
Right.
he mentioned in his preface that someone had done a dissertation, that would be me, S.D. Raeburn, but
Yep.
he didn't happen to mention that I had used the exact same structure of Kerry Cooper's occupational stress categories that he used. And,
Right.
so I kind of went, so when
Yeah.
I found an address for him, which was, more like early aughts, I wrote him a letter and said, "Yay for you." And I also sent him the published article from 1987 of
Yep.
that work.
Two
But,
years prior. Yeah. Yeah.
this
Yeah.
was the cool thing about musicians, and Jeff Wills particularly. His reaction to my letter, that was friendly, but I went, um, was to send me, in those days, a CD of his. He was a drummer in a Mersey beat band in like the 60s. So Jeff sent me the thing about his band. So, I mean, that's how it went, right? So this is why, again, my love for this whole thing, right? Okay, so anyway, where were we? So PAMA, did help during that time because, and this is a long story, you won't have to, happy to share it personally, but not on a public view with you. Anyway, but I found out about PAMA and the journal by someone who, Frank Wilson, who I met at a conference that was supposed to be the first international conference at NYU in, like, I want to say 1985 or six. It was
Mhm.
after I'd done my dissertation. So I show up at this conference and got turned on to Alice Bronfenbrenner, who was the founder of PAMA, along with Dick Letterman, who's a neurologist at the Cleveland Clinic in Ohio.
Mhm.
Alice, unfortunately, has passed away some years ago, but she and Dick Letterman founded Performing Arts Medical Association. She was working like in Chicago at the Institute of Rehab or something. So she was the editor of the journal and said, "Yeah, let's publish this rock music research." And what I always remember is the first time I went to PAMA, it used to always be in like Aspen. Here I am with all these older, mostly MDs, working with classical, like symphony, and maybe some ballerinas. It was all classically oriented. PAMA, and I was a lowly PhD, and I wasn't an MD.
Mm.
But I was at Stanford Medical Center, so I think they probably went, okay, she can't be all bad. But anyway, so here I am talking about that work, and talking about bands with names like the Mutants and Snakefinger and Romeo Void and like um, you know the Dead Kennedys, and they're all sitting there going like, "Who let her in?" was my fantasy. But I have to say, PAMA over the years now is much hipper than it used to be. I'm still hanging in there, and now we have actors because of my friend Mark Seaton in Australia. They really have embraced that.
Yep.
There's more mental health, not enough. And some of my younger colleagues, who I won't name, pretty much are not into doing something for no money. Well, my dedication to PAMA has been at my own expense for all these years. So not everybody is willing to do that, right? I understand it, But anyway, so PAMA, I would like to have the conceit that my presence there has helped them widen out their categories over the years. And now it's, quite
Yeah.
more balanced than it used to be in a good way, although we could still use more mental health people. One thing I wanted that speaks to several of your questions, and This was not in the articles I wrote, but that was from my original dissertation. So I went down and picked up the tome of it and went like, what was that? But I'm going to read the preface that I wrote to that dissertation and Howard Becker's comments, and which
Right.
really talks a lot about where we've landed now and what needs to be different. Okay, so let me just indulge myself and read this from it.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yes.
Okay, so I said the musicians in this study were not superstars, although some of them may eventually achieve that status. Rather, they represent what Howard Becker in 1982 has called practicing professionals, with some more fully integrated into the rock music art world than others.
Mhm.
But as Dr. Becker kindly pointed out in a personal communication, these are indeed the people who make up the bulk of the rock musician population. And I think we can expand the point here to other creatives like
Right.
journalists and the people you write about.
Yep.
I was very lucky that year because Becker happened to be on a sabbatical, and he's a photographer as well, and
Mm.
was at the San Francisco Art Institute living there. So Robert Faulkner, who's another idol of mine, academic who wrote about movie industry composers and stuff, Faulkner told me I had talked to him. And, I tell young people when they're wanting to call someone like you or me or George Musgrave, and I said, some people are very open-hearted and are you right in there with them, and that's how I think we are. And other people are kind of not and can be very snotty. And I want to swear here, but I'm trying not to.
Right.
So I just tell people, like, don't get discouraged if someone that you reach out to is not receptive. Let's
Right.
put it that way, because someone else may be, right? So Becker was one of those people. It was very cool that he happened to be in the Bay Area when I was trying to do all this. So he became kind of an unofficial member of my dissertation committee, along with like Ben Fontoris, here in the Bay Area and stuff. And so Becker, it turns out, played clarinet or something with Lenny Tristano and was a big fan of Boyd's band. So, I was part of the family already. So he was very
Wow.
sweet. And, I had a couple of lovely afternoon chats with him while he was there. So anyway, back to what he said. Um, okay. So again, the practicing professionals or make up the bulk of the rock music population musician. And then I wrote, this ratio is structurally overdetermined as the following observation by Simon Frith,
Right.
1981 suggests. And so this is from Frith. The music industry markets far more products than it sells, and poor musicians are as necessary to the system as rich ones. And then Dr.
Mhm.
Becker noted further how current art world assumptions operate to exclude potential participants. Becker wrote, if the arts were organized differently, less professional, less star-oriented, less centralized, that support might be available. The
Right.
problems arise when thousands of students hope to become Broadway stars, premier ballerinas at a major company, or winners of the Nobel Prize in Literature. But the arts might be, and have at times been, organized so that these were not the available or reasonable goals to aim at.
Mm.
End of quote from Becker. So I said, the musicians in the current study struggling to earn a living clearly need more than good personal coping skills in the face of the larger music industry structure. As Perlin and Schooler wrote in 1978, coping failures do not necessarily reflect the shortcomings of
Of the
individuals.
individuals.
In
Yeah.
a real sense, they may represent the failure of social systems in which the individuals are enmeshed.
Yep.
End of my preface.
That's
So unfortunately, this stays more relevant than ever, in my humble opinion, to try to say, where are we at?
it's
Uh,
it's it's so thank you so much for sharing that. And it's so powerful. I mean, especially that notion that, if you fail, that's not individual failure, it's system failure.
yeah.
And that notion of the star system, right? That both is how the industry is structured, but also sometimes how people that go into this industry self-identify.
Yes.
And in some of the interviews that I'm doing in this series, I've spoken to people from professional associations that actually this is what they're now investing most of their resources in, is what they call, like in the US, you have the behind the scenes foundation, they call it the career transition advice, which is that what they find is that too many people try to make it work in creative careers, thinking that at some point it will work, they become a star, and in the process they're burning themselves up, both economically, like going through their savings and,
Yeah.
marriage fails and everything, but also, of course, psychologically, mentally. And they've so these organizations are setting up resources to help people remind that, you actually have a really good marketable skill set. Yes, you might not play Wembley,
Yeah.
but you will be able to make a very good living for you and your family. So why not? But that is still for so many people so hard, and it really speaks to the point that you're making there.
And George Musgrave has talked about that in a good way,
Mm,
where he called it the gambling, like the same problem of magical thinking, to hold out. If I'm not a star, I'm nothing.
right.
Um, that's not a helpful perspective, at this point,
Mm.
given the numbers of people involved. So
Well, it also speaks,
yeah,
if I may, about that notion of, wanting to be a star. I mean, in your publications, you've talked about the pervasiveness of like the fantasy of the creative career, like in music, it would be like the rock myth, like live fast, die young, and sort of, and that is
yeah, yeah,
almost. And I can tell you from my own research that you have versions of that myth in all the big media industries,
yeah,
like where, for example, overwork extreme overwork is almost celebrated, like that is
yeah,
like a badge of honor, and how cool it is to, yeah, in other words, burn yourself up,
right,
and in
right,
journalism, hanging out late at night and drinking too much coffee, it's sort of like, yeah, that's cool. And
yeah,
it's
yeah.
it's
No,
and
good
and
point.
and so there's that. So on the one hand we have this sort of myth making of being an artist, being creative, turning that into a career. But the other hand, like what we talked about earlier, it's clear that our society doesn't take the plight of creative seriously. And to me, that's such a bizarre paradox, right? We
Totally.
mythify creative work, and then we also don't take it seriously.
Yeah,
How
yeah.
have you come across that? Does
Yeah,
that
no,
paradox mean
and
anything to
again,
you?
it's a structural problem, and so trying to help individuals, which is primarily what my work has been,
Hmm.
um, it really is trying to broaden out those kind of ways of thinking about stuff in the way you said too. But what I said about the that thing about simultaneously glorifying and celebrating the artist, I said Dr. Becker's comments are more relevant than ever. However, the structural issues in the industry are also clearer now. And I think that the rock myth has lost traction with many younger artists, not everybody, although you know, one thing in the addiction field that is clear as a risk factor is what they call sensation seeking.
Hmm.
That's just kind of more is better, you know, to the max. That's a risk for addiction. So, um, you know, so the rock myth, if they happen to be absorbing it by someone who has that sensation seeking kind of personality, then they're probably going to be in more trouble.
Right.
It's certainly risk for addiction, but maybe other stuff too, like not having enough built in safety awareness or something. But this is where it got a big splash here in the States at the Grammys when Chappell Rowan called
Yes.
out the industry.
Right.
And I happen to read in the New York Times, which I faithfully read just on Sundays, usually a week late. Gaga did a whole interview in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago where she comments about her career and her reaction to Chappell Rowan's comments. And what she basically said is, when I was a young artist, I was too self-absorbed to think about the greater structure of things. And now I
Mm.
wish I had. So
Wow.
Gaga, very much was supporting what Chappell Rowan was saying. But what was really striking about the reaction to that statement from Chappell Rowan was that apparently some artists started donating money to an organization you're probably aware of called Backline,
Right.
that has gotten has been developed over probably the last 5 years, I want to say. Um, but anyway, and so all of a sudden, Backline is getting all these donations to be able to beef up their services, nonprofit services for musicians trying to be in therapy and stuff like that. And or groups like the one I'm more associated with is Music Industry Therapist Collective with Tamsin Embleton, because of getting involved in, now Tamsin is one of my loved one friends, uh, of her book on touring and mental health, the Music
Right.
Industry Manual, which I'm sure you know all about.
Yeah.
So anyway, you know, because Backline is directly, and the people that I first learned about Backline was from Chaim Newman in Toronto and Zach Bohr in LA, who branched off out of Backline and started something called Amber Health. And, uh, basically they want to make a living behind this, and they're in direct competition with MITC at this point.
Mm.
So, but the good news is there's plenty of need for everybody. And then it really is about how the changes in the industry around, from the top down to tour managers. MITC is in the process right now of helping develop some tour resources for like Tate McRae, who's a young singer, uh, and
Right.
trying to figure out how to, make tours healthier, basically. So, all of those changes in the industry that I'm very happy that Tamsin wrote to me saying, "Do you want to be?" And I go, "Who is this?"
Mm.
"Oh, well, that sounds cool."
Yeah.
"Oh, and you're going to pay me to write something?" "Okay." So anyway, it's been interesting to watch how some of that's built out.
You mentioned the MITC, and maybe it's good to for the people who watch or listen to this to know a little bit more. The Music Industry Therapist Collective. I mean, it seems to be growing still,
Yes.
like with more people, like in UK, in North America, in Germany, I think now signing on.
India, we have a member from India now.
Right.
Yeah.
So how did that come about, and what role does it play in all of this? Could
Yeah.
could you? Yeah.
Well, on a personal level, because of Tamsin Embleton reaching out to me to contribute to her book, I've learned a lot more about what's out there now. And it's just so, just like George Musgrave or your work, I mean, it's just very encouraging. And,
Mm.
again, I'm less lonely than I used to be with all this, right?
Mm.
Um, but Tamsin, for those of your audience who haven't heard about all this, Tamsin was a tour manager for like 10 years before she got trained as a therapist. And everyone in MITC, but me, really, I'm the only one who never had a formal job in the music industry. I've just been writing about this and doing free stuff at South by Southwest for years, right? So they let me in anyway, even though I didn't technically have a paycheck from the industry. So Tamsin, started MITC, started interviewing people, came up with this book idea, and I guess the way she found me initially was because a colleague of mine from PAMA, Paula Thompson, who's really one of the most brilliant people I know, who writes about stuff like creativity and stress and stuff. Paula became the clinical like editor of Tamsin's book. They met at a conference on attachment,
Mm.
which is the realm we all kind of share an interest in.
Sure.
So that's how Tamsin found me. And then, I ended up working very directly with her on her chapters for the book, not just mine.
Yeah.
So anyway, that all built out. So by the time MITC is there, even though, between us, I'm not really taking new clients. Having said that, I got like last 2 years ago, I got a couple of soulful letters from Bay Area musicians
Mm.
that were just very smart and heartwarming. And I went, okay, well, let's do a consult, And of course, I ended up taking them on as new clients. And they're both like in their late 40s, had got, were touring in their late 20s and ended up losing their contracts. And one of them got really disappointed. They both have new projects and learning, which I'm observing the differences in the music industry with just how people go about promoting their work. And, it's so changing and different with everything now, Spotify, everything,
Sure.
so anyway, but so Tamsin started MITC. There are other groups like Amber Health, doing the same stuff. And, there's plenty of need for everyone. But what's really
Mm.
clear to me is that some of this change has to be coming from the real powers that be with the money at
Right.
the industry, uh, stakeholders, right?
Yeah.
And in the past, that's what kind of never trickled from the down up, right?
Mm.
It's got to get clear from and the whole thing we're talking about of like, how come people don't want to invest in their artists' careers over time, not the, live fast, die young, right?
Mm.
And make a bunch of money and then ditch them.
Yep.
And the industry is so weird, like even you think of the Buena Vista Social Club, which I mentioned in one of those papers, of 1 minute they're like the guys, shining shoes in Havana, and the next minute Ry Cooder comes in there and makes them a star and they're touring and stuff. I mean, not all industries are that weird, right? So,
Yeah.
you never know which up, up the down escalator, as Graham Parker once wrote about,
Yeah.
gonna be falling on. Okay, so
Yeah.
anyway,
Well, no, no, thanks for that. I mean, and speaking about this, about the weirdness of the industry. Um, One thing that, I mean, you've mentioned our mutual friend George Musgrave, and his colleague Sally Ann Gross is their work
yeah,
on musicians' mental health, and they make a point in their book that they directly reference back to your work, and you talk about this as well, is that part of the weirdness of creative work in general and in the music in particular is that people embody their work.
yes.
And I'm assuming also from what I've read and from what little I understand, of course, as not being trained in that, that working with the body and somatically is an important part of helping clients, especially given the embodied nature of their industry. I mean,
Yeah.
would you mind sharing a little bit about what that means to you, like working with the body, taking the body seriously in all of this, and
Yes.
embodiment of creative work?
Yes. And these are great questions, by the way.
Um,
Uh, one thing when I used to supervise, pre-doc or postdoctoral interns in psychology, what I'd always tell them would be like, everything you think you're positive about now, wait 10 years and let's see what we know. In other words, like, let's stay flexibly open to learning new things. And one of those things that the field of psychology has definitely gotten hipper to was the power of the body and somatic influences. And, basically people like Alan Shore, who started really as a neuropsychologist in LA, uh, talking about the power of what's called the implicit memory system or the unconscious. Freud's back in vogue, at least at that level, of talking about that the implicit memory system is pre-verbal, is really running the show on a lot of stuff. And the explicit memory system, which is more verbally mediated, comes online later.
mhm.
And we all think that that's running the show. Well, guess what, kids? It's not.
Right.
So I think all of the work like Bessel van der Kolk, who blows my mind, his book's been on the bestseller list for like a million years now,
Yeah.
going, dude, you
Body
probably have
keeps the
a house,
score. Yeah.
you have 5 houses, and or maybe you donated all to charity, I don't know. But you know, hopefully he's not running for public office to be
Right.
autocrat. Anyway, um, so, I think most psychologists and certainly young people growing up in the field now are much more aware of all this kind of stuff. So stuff like the power of the body. I mean, even in my generation, we had like bioenergetics and Organ Box with Reich and stuff, but none of it really infiltrated into the mainstream psychological training. It was always an offshoot. This implicit memory system, I think everybody has much better understanding of the importance of it now.
Mm.
Doesn't mean all therapists do that, but I think for me, I part of the thing that's very cool about being in my field is it has remained, yay for me, interesting to me, the new stuff. So I try to keep up,
Mm.
with like, what are we learning now that we didn't used to know? And which is the exciting part of being in the field, right? Even though
Right.
I'm working, oh, guess what? Only 2 days a week. Yay. No, highly recommended. Too bad you have to be this old to have that freedom. Um, but anyway, so it has made an impact on bringing the body into it. And you think about performers, the intent, especially say the lead singer in a band, where, some of the artists I work with, which of course I would love to gossip about the names and I can't do it, but that are really, playing major stadium shows into their late 50s and all this kind of stuff.
Mm.
The intensity of that, again, positive awe is something greater than yourself and the relationship with the audience. All of that is so embodied, at
Mm.
this point. And then part of the problem is people have to calm the heck down,
Yeah, yeah.
getting it back into regular life, which Tamsin's book does a beautiful job of really laying out like what happens and how to work with that, right? So highly recommended, if artists and apparently Live Nation bought 3,000 copies to put in green room. So if it's an expensive book, so hopefully artists in a green room can buy, look at a free copy, whatever.
That is actually really great to hear. That makes a difference. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll see.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so I think that those were the main notes that I made to myself about sensation seeking and uh, you know,
And the role
um,
of the body and the significance
yeah,
of rest, as you say, and how hard it can be to be at rest when you're in a creative environment. But also the link, from a embodied perspective between some of the issues that are enduring for the creative industries and also specifically music, alcohol, substance abuse, unhealthy living, like you said, poor sleep. I mean, all of these are so. Of course, they're problematic for anybody,
right,
but they are part of the DNA of creative industries. I mean, in every industry that I do research in, they talk about how problematic its drinking culture is, and that your next job is at the bar, right? That's where you find it. So,
right,
but those are very much embodied issues. Both, so you embody, your passion for creating art, but also that's where you're suffering because of it.
yeah.
That must be, or I wonder if that's really let me put it this way: is taking the body seriously a gateway for you to deal with clients, like another way to engage or to make things perhaps easier to talk about?
Well, again, I'm trying to embody it myself with paying attention to my own states and,
Hmm.
but in the room, being in the here and now in the room with a client, I'm noticing what's changing with them or whatever. And, you know, um, one thing that we do now a lot in therapy is talk about like grounding exercises around
Right.
someone being able to come back into the moment when they're going off somewhere. And so having people increase their self-awareness about where in their body uh, they may be experiencing stress or whatever it is. So, there's some education, of course, that comes into any of this in the clinical work. And some clients are very sophisticated with this stuff, or maybe dancers, say, that are used to thinking about their bodies in a different way than everybody else. So, in general, it depends, of course, on the specific case. The whole thing of assuming you know something based on DSM-5 or some crap, or some stuff. It's not total crap, but it's kind of, very non-positive psychology oriented. And Eric Maisel has written a lot in these series he's doing for Ethics International about problems with the DSM and
Hmm.
medicalization of psychology and everything. Um, so you want to increase awareness and work with that in the room with the client, right? And so it varies. Yeah.
If we look at, maybe in conclusion, at your work, I mean, now 4 decades at least 4 decades in this field, obviously, like you say, I mean, the source of our insights is changing. We're learning new stuff. More people are getting involved. Mental health and well-being in for musicians and for anybody in the music or other creative industries taken more seriously. Um, and then, as we talked about earlier, we keep coming back to this is all great, but for something to really change, it also has to come from the top, right? I mean, something in the structure of the industry needs to change. Now, do you have any inclination, any observation that there's some movement there? We know that there's, like you mentioned earlier, Chappelle Rowan, Lady Gaga, other well-known artists, Billie Eilish, is speaking up, speaking out about mental health issues, make destigmatizing these
Yeah.
conversations. Is there any, do you see anything at the industry level here, or is the industry actually becoming even more, data, numbers, metrics driven than in the past?
It's hard for me to say in my little private Idaho, but Tamsin shared and I think she and Peter Robinson from MITC went because I forget the artist. I wasn't a fan. I didn't know the band who jumped, basically suicided off a building. British artist, young guy. I
Hmm.
forget now, and he had an addiction problem. But anyway, Parliament invited Tamsin and Peter to come and talk to them
Right,
about what needs to happen. So, I don't remember that happening before. Where it goes, who knows, right? But, hopefully there's some, I mean, even on the level of just business, you'd think that protecting your artist's longevity somewhere in there has got to pay off. It's not, instant karma on the, funding probably, but over time. But I do think the extreme wealth disparity going on in the world and the country, right, in the States is a problem, whether or not
right.
people in the music industry or creative industries. I mean, look at what's happened in journalism.
Hmm.
I mean, uh, this is not the way I was hoping to grow older myself and watch things happening here. Yeah, so I think along the lines of Dr. Becker of saying that the industry and the culture needs to improve practical support for the full range of creative careers, not just the superstars. We need the
Right.
working musicians up. So that point that I've been talking about for a long time, but so I'm going to read you the conclusion that I wrote.
Oh, cool. Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
That's a
Uh,
beautiful way to wrap this up. Thank
well,
you. Yeah.
also, as you might have already figured out for yourself, even as not a psychologist, just like a journalist and academic person,
Mhm.
I'm a talker, and I can drift and add a lot of sidebars that even my husband's going like, get to the point. So anyway, I do my best to be self-aware of that imperfectly. But anyway, so what I wrote here was in the 80s and 90s, I hope that by 2025, climate change would have been addressed globally, human rights would be strengthened, and musicians and other creatives would have health insurance and better structural supports overall.
Mm.
We are seeing we are seeing decreased stigma as artists have gone public about mental health. So that's good,
Right.
in terms of shifting things around. But again, we're back to the larger structures here that really need to be improved significantly across all the fields that we care about, right?
Right.
So
Well, for what it's worth, the work that you've done for all this time genuinely has made a difference, not just in the PAMA, but just in general, and in how it's now inspired this whole new generation of work and scholarship. It's truly wonderful, and it definitely has shaped my work. So I want to say personal thank you for that too,
thanks,
and
Mark.
thank you so much for your time for doing this.
Oh, it's
And
fun.
and
Nice to
for
get to know you more, and at some point I'd like to hear maybe off screen more of your story.